and Values Conversation about Research Ethics program, which is funded by the Office of Research at Ohio State and is supported by the UMC Center for Bioethics and the College of Public Health. I am delighted to have Dr. Daniel Goroff and Dr. Caroline Wagner to be speaking with us today on the ethics of corporate academic partnerships. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot in the news right now about sort of the ethics of industry-funded research, but funding isn't the only valuable resource that companies can offer academic researchers. There's also an enormous amount of wealth of data being collected, which has great potential to be studied for the purposes of understanding and addressing today's social and public health challenges, but which may be inaccessible due to consumer privacy, trade secrets, and proprietary matters. And so today we're going to be talking about all of the ways in which there are ethical challenges and also really important opportunities for innovation when it comes to these corporate academic partnerships. And I'm delighted to have these two experts speaking with us today. So we first will hear from Dr. Daniel Goroff, who is Vice President and Program Director at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which is a charity that supports breakthroughs in science, technology, and economics. And he's also currently temporary in part at the National Science Foundation as the Division Director for Social and Economic Sciences. He's worked twice as the President's Science Advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And he's been recently served as the Assistant Director of Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences. He's also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, where he helped found the Science Philanthropy Alliance, the Research on Research Institute, and the Societal Experts Action Network. We're also really excited to have Dr. Caroline Wagner, who's the Wolf Chair in International Affairs at the John Glenn College of Public Health here at Ohio State. Professor Wagner received a PhD in Science and Technology Dynamics at Amsterdam University. She joined Ohio State as faculty in 2011, and prior to that, she was a policy analyst working with and for government in a number of different ways. I think most recently before Ohio State was at the RAND Corporation, and she's particularly interested in collaborative efforts to conduct research, development, and innovation. And I'm so excited to have the two of you here. And I'm no longer going to sort of talk about your accolades. Instead, this is sort of the structure of the panel. We'll hear from Dr. Goroff first, and he's sort of going to frame some of the ethical challenges and also the opportunities that he's seen in his research and in his work. And then we'll give an opportunity for Dr. Wagner to respond and lend her own sort of perspective and expertise. And I've come up with a number of questions that we could sort of talk about for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we're gonna open it up for discussion. So the last 20 to 15 minutes should be discussion. There should be ample time for discussion. So if you look at the bottom corner of your screen, I believe there's a Q&A session. Please, whenever you have a question, type out a question throughout the session, and we're going to definitely get to those by the end of the session. So to no further ado, I'll let Dr. Goroff take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Dana. It's really great to be with you and with Caroline and with the whole team here. The one thing I have to say is that I was not the President's Science Advisor, but I did work for the President's Science Advisor at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House twice. But I am the Vice President and Program Director of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and I have been doing some work in Washington as well. But I want to emphasize that I'm not representing any of those institutions today, and that the views are really strictly my own. And I mean that quite literally, because a few of them are rather idiosyncratic and not so widely held. So whatever I say, I'm responsible, and none of the institutions that I'm affiliated with. Let me just start by reminding people, I hope that they know that Alfred P. Sloan is the person who put together and ran General Motors. And so the Sloan Foundation, as Diana said, does support research on science and technology and economics. And so therefore, the economics of science is a very natural topic for us. And these days, that very much includes the economics of data as well. And I'll just mention that when people tell the history of data science, they often start by pointing to the Sloan Digital Sky Survey as the very first example of a big data research project. And there's still a lot that we can learn and a lot that's still being used from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And we can talk about that a little bit later. It's not just even the data itself, but I would say the social engineering that went into the design of that project that also has lessons in addition to the software and many other tools. So how did I get interested in corporate and administrative data? Well, it's really rather simple. I don't know about you, but I just don't want to live in a world where only a few companies know or think they know what's going on. And there is a lot of potential to spot and analyze trends from all the data that's being collected. I think the observations are actually a lot less useful than many people think. The opportunity to run experiments using big data is even more powerful. And so there are a lot of economics papers, more and more, that are using this kind of data. And I usually talk about it when I say this kind of data as administrative data. And what I mean by that is any sort of information that was collected for other than research purposes. So that would include all kinds of transaction records that come from companies, but also government records as well. And just, as I say, anything that wasn't meant for research when it was originally put together. So when you're reproducing, when you're repurposing data like that, you can get a lot of intriguing results, but they tend to be really hard won. Because the data wasn't originally collected for research purposes, it's often missing metadata. There's often a lot of missing data. There's a lot of cleaning to be done. The stories and the context are often missing also. So there's a lot of work to be done before you can actually make good sense out of data like this. That's to say, administrative data. And it's also, by and large, totally irreproducible. So you may get some intriguing results, but you don't really always know what to make of them. And moreover, the transaction costs to come up with these sorts of arrangements are just crazy. They're just frightful sometimes, where you hear about people who have been negotiating with a company for years and they think they have an agreement and they're starting the work and the PhD students are all excited about it. And then suddenly someone switches offices or some lawyer walks in and it's all over. So there are all kinds of things like this, or where they tell you that this column means this and that column means that, and it turns out it's the other way around. So there are just tons of crazy stories about how difficult it is for people to actually manage these relationships with corporations or with government. And so I really salute the center here and the work that OSU has been doing to organize some collective action about data sharing, because it does strike me, and this is a theme that perhaps I'll return to, that everybody trying to solve this problem on their own or pairwise isn't going to work. it's too hard. And that's mostly what we've been doing. And, you know, there are brave souls who kind of make it work, but to really have these relationships be as transparent and as helpful and as really generative as they could be, I think will take some different ways of thinking about data and different ways of thinking about what we do. And again, I don't think that we can solve all these things working pairwise or one-on-one and everybody coming up with their own data use agreement. And that strikes me as madness. And so trying to help figure out other ways of doing this is something that I've been thinking hard about and trying to help other people who are thinking much harder about it and actually doing things. So let me just mention quickly a couple of themes, and I'll say a sentence or two about each. And then I think I'll turn it over to Caroline and just enjoy talking to everybody about what they think. So I wrote down 5 themes. The first is the special challenges of administrative data. And I said something about that because it's not for research purposes, that all the kind of things that you would normally have if you were a researcher collecting data in a laboratory are missing. And in particular, the stories that go along with this. So I want to underscore that data by itself, especially observational data, is often really very suggestive, but less useful and less reliable than many people think. And that unless you really can codify in some way, and I think the best way of codifying it is with a directed acyclic graph, but that's another conversation. But unless you codify it in some way, to try to draw causal conclusions from any of this is really difficult. And so you need to work hard to understand the situation and not just get a big download of data. I don't know how many researchers who I've talked to have said, oh, if we could just get this data. And I say, well, what are you going to do with it? And they say, I don't know, but if we could just get this data, we could do all these great things. So that I think is kind of the wrong way around. So that's the first point. The second theme I would point to is privacy protection concepts and fallacies. So privacy protection is a big topic. I don't have a lot to say other than as a private citizen about consumer privacy and all the rest of that. But when researchers go to use a data set, how can they work with it in a way that provably protects the privacy or indeed the proprietary rights of whoever is in that data set? So I think that that's a really important question. And the answer that most people try to think about is you have to de-identify the data, that you have to anonymize the data somehow before the company could give it to a researcher or anything like that. Well, whenever anybody talks to you about that, you should laugh. That's just a joke. You cannot anonymize data. And you can't de-identify it. And I'm not talking about all the examples where people have linked to some data with some other data set that no one knew was around, and all of a sudden they've re-identified people. Those are interesting and not so hard to do. In fact, really pretty easy to do these days. I'm talking about theorems, where the basic theorems are that if you answer too many questions about a data set too accurately, that you can essentially reconstruct the whole data set. And so this is just a fact. And there's experiments that have been done to see how practical this was and how scary it is, including some that were performed on 2010 census data. So you think, well, the census tables, what could you tell from census tables? And it turns out that for many, many millions of people in the country, depending on how you think of it, maybe a quarter or a third of the people in the country, you can uniquely identify them just from the published census tables. So what do I mean? You can do some linear algebra and you figure out that there's exactly one person in the whole country who lives in this zip code, who's of that gender and that age and this and that. And once you figured out that there's exactly one person like that, you can go to Palantir or lots of other places and for pennies, find out thousands of fields of information about them. Anything you want to know about them, their names, their addresses, social security numbers, I mean, virtually anything. So that kind of re-identification is actually not so hard to do anymore. And so those are one kind of theorem. The other kinds of theorem is that you can prevent that, but the only way of preventing that re-identification is to add a little bit of noise to the answers that people get when they ask queries. So if a researcher asks a query, you have to add a little bit of very carefully selected noise. This is a technique called differential privacy. It's not an algorithm, but it's a class of algorithms. It's a criteria for deciding whether or not something is actually producing the privacy protection that you think. I can say lots more about it. Sloan has been funding work in this area from the very beginning, but privacy protection, I think, is important. I'll just say something very quickly and more directly about the ethical research responsibilities. And that's that, in my view, it's very much easier for, in these discussions, everyone to say what somebody else should do or what somebody else shouldn't do. And it's much more of a challenge to say something about what we're doing and what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And there, it strikes me that a lot of the empirical methodology that we as researchers use is pretty lousy. A lot of the claims that we make are not defensible. You may have already heard this, but somebody told me the other day that there's actually a difference between correlation and causation. And so a lot of people seem to ignore that. And a lot of them who are doing machine learning, for example. But I, for one, don't want to give away any of my privacy or any of my time or any of my grants budgets for junk science. And so that's something that we can do that is, I think, part of our ethical responsibility. Fourth, let me say something quickly about the economics of research data. People often think that it's a public good. I would like to think that it can be used for the public good, but in the way economists use the term public good, they mean something that's not excludable and not rival. So it's hard to keep people from using it, and you don't use it up when you use it. So the classical example is a lighthouse or a basic scientific discovery. And I would argue that actually both of those criteria are wrong, that it's certainly excludable unless you specifically talk about open data. Then it's very easy for me to exclude people from using the data. But moreover, and more surprisingly, data actually is rival in the sense that the evidence that you get from it gets used up. I mean, we tend to think, well, it's out there, anybody can use it, there's just as much of it left. And I think that that's wrong. And that some of that comes out from this theory of differential privacy, because every time you ask a query, you leak a little bit of privacy. You can control that rate using these noise methods and differential privacy and so on. But every time you ask a question of a data set, you leak a little privacy, you just do. And every time you ask a query, even if it's about stars or rocks or something else where nobody cares about the privacy, you also leak a little validity. And I can say more about that, but the quick reason why I would assert that is because you get closer and closer to p hacking, where you're just messing around with the data and reporting some p-value that is the last one that you got, but doesn't reflect the fact that you tried 100 or 1,000 or maybe 1,000,000 things first. Finally, let me just point to the institutional arrangements that are needed. There's a school of economics that says that when transaction costs are really frightful, the way I mentioned to begin with, that the solutions are institutional. And I would argue that what we need are intermediaries of various sorts that deal with whole sectors at a time and negotiate data use agreements with not just one company, but a dozen companies at a time, really knows that sector and can put the data together in a way that researchers can use, and then negotiates with the researchers what they can and can't do with it, and so on. There are examples of things like that that I can point to and discuss in more detail, but I like to call them administrative data research facilities. And we can talk more about that too. But those are a couple of themes that I hope we'll be able to discuss further. And with that, let me turn it over to Caroline.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you so much, Dana, for organizing today. And we really appreciate Daniel Goroff visiting us and bringing all of his wisdom and experience to bear on this really interesting set of questions that we have before us. One of the things I thought I could contribute is a little bit of how we got here to this point, because we know that Daniel has brought us a number of really critical ethical questions regarding corporate academic relationships. And how did we get to this point in terms of these relationships and where we're at? If we look back a little bit in history, we can see that a lot of the changes that motivated the relationship shift between corporate research and academic research really began to occur in the 1970s, 1980s, when we became aware of what we call now the knowledge economy. It was driven quite a bit by advances in science, but particularly by advances in technology and the contributions of technology, especially the semiconductor and the semiconductor industry, in how we understand wealth creation and value add. And at that time, the US government changed several laws in a fundamental way that influenced the relationship between companies and the academic sector, kind of shifting in a way the nature of who can own what from that relationship. Who owns the intellectual property out of that work? And the idea then, what shifted really is this idea that academic research is not just about finding something new or contributing new knowledge to the great pool of knowledge, but that there may be some value in academic institutions having the incentive to own the results of their work, right? And so what we saw is that a law was passed called the Bayh-Dole Act. And it came out of the committee I worked for on the Capitol Hill. But the Bayh-Dole Act allowed institutions like Ohio State to actually retain the rights to their own intellectual property, resulting from even corporate academic collaborations. And in fact, those are the ones that oftentimes result in IP. And now you can go to almost any large university like Ohio State, and there'll be whole pages of discussion on who's going to own the IP and how it's going to be shared. And so really, then what you see out of that, the laws that were changed were the right to retain intellectual property, an incentive for companies to increase their spending on R&D and an R&D tax credit. The credit goes to incremental increases, not to your whole budget, but to increases in research and development. And then there was a change in antitrust law that allowed companies and working also jointly with academic sectors to basically collaborate, okay? That if you were working on basic research, it was okay to collaborate. And what it doesn't make it legal, but it reduces the damages that you would incur as a company if you were to engage in this collaboration. And as far as I know, there haven't been any laws, legal lawsuits brought under that, challenging that relationship. So out of this shift in public policy, then what we see is that universities then are given what's called a third mission, that in addition to education, in addition to conducting all this wonderful, supposedly open research that's supposed to be free and open for everyone to come and use and create wealth, that we also have this third mission of translating that knowledge into useful product, process, and services. And so you add on to the university now and really shifting its relationship with corporations, because now in a way, the university is almost like a little competitor, right, with companies. So you have this, what used to be a much more complementary relationship, now adding on this two things, adding on this potential competition, and then the second thing, adding this whole third mission, right, onto these universities that were there to do research and open research and to share it widely. And now, of course, you may very well know that universities work very hard to try to create intellectual property and derive value from that. And what we find, of course, is that only a few universities are able to truly turn that into anything like real value and real income. It's a very difficult thing to do. But even so, universities, just like Ohio State, have a technology commercialization office staffed with people who have a very important goal of bringing in funds as a result of research being done at the university. So now we come back to, I think, Daniel Goroff's very important comments, right? Because what we see now is we're coming into this kind of a new era. All right, so maybe we're coming out of the knowledge-based, technology-driven, let universities, gain value from their research. Now we're coming into the data era, data-driven era, when we have another conflict, I think, in the relationship, and that is the tendency now for openness, right? You see it almost everywhere: open research, open data, open science, open platforms, and there is just such a pressure, especially I think from the younger generation. This is where I'd like to hear from Dana, and others, who are younger researchers, because us oldsters, came out of this, Bayh-Dole era. But I think now what we're seeing is really this pressure on openness. And Daniel mentioned reproducibility, right? Validity, verification of work becoming more and more important. Government even being willing to pay more for that now, to have work validated and verified, reproduced in some ways. And we see whole fields being blown up right now because they can't validate or verify or reproduce earlier work, right? So it's an amazing time. But okay, so now we have this basis that we built on, like, okay, own your own IP, make money off of what you do. And now we're running that up against openness, right? And how do we share data openly? Can we share it? Daniel brought up some very interesting ideas about open sharing, open data. Like, does it really exist? Even that's another question. But increasingly, especially in the work I do on international collaboration in science and technology, right, we're seeing this tension bubbling up there at the international level. Okay, so we have these groups of people that are working together internationally. Who owns the results of the work? How do we say where the data resides? Where does the value accrue? Does everybody benefit equally from these kinds of global relationships that we're setting up? And if not, right, then you get into questions like, well, how come Brazil isn't benefiting as much as Germany from these collaborative research projects? And well, shouldn't we have some kind of symmetry in those relationships? So I see that we're coming out of one period and maybe coming into another period, but along with that goes many, many ethical questions associated with data, open sharing, open publishing, and so many other aspects that I see just many questions that we could begin to ask ourselves. And I'd love to hear from our our audience too about what they think about this kind of tension now that I think is an added one on top of third mission, right? Translate your knowledge into products and services, and do it with open data, right? Open share, and make sure you don't own anything and the time that you're sharing you're open. So anyway, I do think that creates some kind of very interesting and challenging questions for us. So with that, I'll pass to the group.
Thank you so much. And so I have some questions. I just want to let the audience know that now is the time to start populating the Q&A. So if you want any further discussion about something that you've heard, there's so much that has already been talked about. Please start sharing now. Daniel, do you want to, are there any points that you want to respond to Caroline, or anything that you want to add before we go to some of the questions?
No, I think that was a great context, and I certainly agree that the laws changing have just had various unintended consequences, some intended consequences, and then as the technology has changed as well, it's really put us in an interesting situation, and we're still figuring it out.
So thank you so much for both of your sort of explanations. I mean, sometimes these, like, you know, thinking about these issues is very dismaying. And I really appreciate sort of setting the themes, and also just telling us a story about like how to think about the phases of development of sort of the knowledge economy and the new era. Like, that's really helpful, especially the way that you teased out some of the ethical challenges. So some of the questions that I'm going to ask are primarily coming from thinking through some of these political and ethical questions. And so the first question that I have is just sort of what can we get out of these academic corporate partnerships that we wouldn't have otherwise had without them, right? So, you know, we know that industry can provide resources such as funding. They could provide data, but what sorts of other sorts of resources and other modes of support, like potentially, thinking through one of the things that you said, Caroline, about sort of translational expertise. And so it's like, what sorts of ways in which, what supports and resources can industry provide academia that academics and academic institutions wouldn't be able to do on their own? And vice versa, what can academics provide to these industries that really does make it important for these very different cultures and very different kinds of institutions to collaborate? And maybe I'll start with Daniel, and then we'll go to Caroline.
Yeah, so I think most academics have a pretty good idea of what they want from the corporations, and it's mostly data. You know, sometimes it's consulting gigs and other things like that. But I want to turn to the second part of your question, because I think it's really important, of what it is that corporations would get out of sharing data with us or cooperating with us a little more broadly. And that goes to what I was saying earlier about intermediaries. And if an intermediary is actually going to be successful, they have to provide something worthwhile to the to both sides. And there are examples. So, for example, if you're interested in scanner data from retail stores, what you don't do is go down the street and talk to the manager of your Whole Foods and say, gee, could I get some of your scanner data? What you do is you go to the Kilt Center if you're in the United States. That's at the University of Chicago. They have all sorts of deals with Nielsen and all sorts of other places, and they know this data really well. You tell them what you want to do. They tell you what's possible, what isn't possible, and within a week you could be up and running and doing your data analysis. Similarly, if you're in and one of the reasons why Nielsen set that up is that they were just tired of dealing with so many academics one at a time. The other thing is that it's good for them, and they get noticed, and they get mentioned, and people hear about their data sets and so on. There's a similar organization called the Consumer Research Data Center that's in London. And they deal with high street retailers like Tesco and Marks and Spencer's. And especially for these, excuse me, companies that weren't born digital, they often don't know what to do with their data, and they have a hard time doing it when they try. So their whole data systems were set up to do transactions, and they can handle that. But if you ask them what was the average size of a purchase at your stores last week, it could take them a year to figure that out, because the data sets are here and they're there and they're in different formats and everything else like that. They just don't know how to do analytics, and they weren't set up to do that. And they get swindled sometimes by little boutique firms who come in and promise them the world, and you know, do a few random kinds of calculations, and maybe they're meaningful and maybe they're not. So to deal with actual academics for them is great. They have lots of data that they didn't know what to do with, that was old and not too useful to them. They didn't want to throw it away, but they weren't sure. So they're happy to send it over to London and to the University of London to get it cleaned up. The University in London, University College London, I should say, in return for this, not only cleans up the data, but prepares some league tables of various sorts about what the trends are in this industry and other things, mindful of the antitrust laws that Caroline mentioned before. But those people find useful. And it turns out that these companies were initially very skittish, but now that a lot of them are doing it, they are willing to pay this center in London to handle their data and to deal with all the academics, not to burn up their lawyers' times with each new project that some crazy academic comes up with. And so for them, it's really worthwhile. And then just one more thing, which is that Sloan commissioned a study of exactly this question by the Future of Privacy Forum that went around and talked to lots of C-suite executives in very large and very important companies and said, well, why would you share data with academics? And, you know, tell us really. And many of them said, oh, they're such a pain in the neck, these academics. But we actually want to be able to do more of that if we can be associated with solving some of society's problems. And if that, and you know, you could say that's a little cynical and everything else like that. But if there are corporations that actually want to try to help solve some of society's problems, who am I to say no, right? That's okay with me. And if they want to be associated with that, that's fine, as long as that's what we're actually really doing. And so that seems to appeal to a lot of people in those positions in a way that saying, gee, I would really like to get another highly cited paper on my CV. That doesn't go very far with them. But if you can say you can be associated with something and that's solving some of society's problems, you know, perhaps through one of these intermediaries that is so labeled, then they're actually pretty interested in trying to figure out safe and responsible ways that they can share data.
So Daniel touches especially on this question of, you know, kind of the negotiated relationship between academics and corporate participants, corporate data. And it's one of the questions actually that I think is worth more discussion, right? And that is, how can we set up the norms of these relationships and establish them in a way that could be more transparent? Because what we've seen in the past is that a lot of these corporate university relationships are, you know, each separately negotiated, and that's true at the international level as well. When we get into these international collaborative research projects, whether you involve a corporation or not, almost all the time these relationships are each just, you know, like a little cottage industry of its own, where people negotiate the norms of the relationship, expecting that everybody accepts that we're doing this in such a way that we're going to share this kind of data, or we have certain kinds of underlying norms of behavior. So, one of the things you asked, Dana, is about, what do corporations look for, and how does the academic side benefit? But here we run into another kind of paradox or conflict, and that is that really academic research does have this role of trying to provide really basic research, basic knowledge, understanding the fundamentals of nature, let's say. And the more we engage with the corporate sector, the more we're working on solving a problem, which can sometimes be a good thing, but a lot of times not, because then you're really working towards the client's goals and not necessarily towards creating just broad, useful knowledge. So this tension within the system of, the academic who wants the highly cited paper, which is a good thing on one hand, towards the need of a client for a product or service can be an internal conflict, and really almost an ethical question for the institution as a whole, right? How much of that is okay to do? How much of it is or how much is too much, right? Because at some point, we know that the basic research that's produced in government labs and academic labs is indeed the, kind of the lifeblood of our innovation system. The more we distort it by trying to race after certain expected goals or products, the more we're kind of choking the goose that lays the golden egg, right? As people have said. And so, so we have this kind of internal tension, I think, also, and Ohio State is very proud, and rightly so, that they're one of the top universities in terms of attracting industry funding. On the other hand, what about, this sort of attention to curiosity-driven, blue sky, really creative and unusual research that sometimes can pay off in a very big way and in a way that's not really understood at the beginning. So I think we're always running into this question, but I think more and more, because we have so many new entrants into the research system, and now I'm talking about my work at the global level and with different countries, right? What you find is that when you're working with people from different countries, that they have different internal norms and goals and expectations that, and sometimes in conflict with the United States. So for example, US and China collaboration, which is now, China is now the United States' #1 partner in research and development. But the fact is that there are a lot of times questions about the norms and expectations on Chinese researchers and on people who are working with them. So we run into that problem, and at times like that, and I like Daniel's comment, I wrote it down, where you have these institutional arrangements when the transaction costs get very high, right? What do you do? And I think we're there with a lot of international collaboration, and maybe also with some of these interinstitutional, intersectoral collaborations between universities and industry.
Can I add one more quick example? Because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this at Ohio State, because they played a key role in this. And I'll just say something briefly about it, and you can ask some of your colleagues a little more. Again, it's very easy to point to others and say, oh, the corporation should do this and they shouldn't do that, and why won't they let me do this? But we're universities, what are we doing? There's a tremendous amount of administrative data that universities have about their hiring, about their grants, about their spending. And there's an institution it's based at the University of Michigan called IRIS. It's the Institute for Research on Science and, it's the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science, IRIS. And they have been collecting up, really hoovering up administrative data from universities all over. cleaning it up, putting it together, sending back league tables, linking it with confidential census data, and arranging with people who are willing to do some work on that data. And I would especially mention your colleague, Bruce Weinberg, to be able to use it and to write fascinating papers about how this grant funded this person who worked with that person in the same lab, who started this company, who did this, who did that, being able to trace through things like that that we never could have done before. And it's because you have that strong intermediary that's willing to do this work on everybody's part and willing to get others to do some of this work in return for easier access and quicker access to the data, that really works. So there are examples like that, and the university should lead the way in showing others how to cooperate and be able to solve problems that they couldn't solve before by responsibly sharing data.
I'll also put in a plug for Cadre, which is the Big Ten Data Initiative. I'm working very closely with them, a Cadre fellow. I'm very grateful for the Big Ten's efforts to put together research data for us. But one of the questions that has been asked about the vaccine being put together for COVID-19, I would like to talk about this and hear from Daniel also, because we see that Pfizer and AstraZeneca have come out and balked recently, very recently, at the idea of a patent pool where they would share their patents so that the rest of the world could take advantage. And they're claiming they put billions of dollars into this research and so on. And yet I would suggest back to them that thousands and thousands of researchers all around the world have been publicly funded to produce quite a lot of the knowledge that they used. And they don't want to go into a WHO patent pool. But I suggest that perhaps that might not be quite fair, given that they didn't do this alone. This has been a worldwide effort. But I'd like to know, Daniel, what do you think about that? What's your take on ownership on the COVID-19 vaccine?
So I just have to say that I don't understand the pharmaceutical industry. And Mr. Sloan asked the foundation not to fund biomedicine because he said his money for that went to Memorial Sloan Kettering. And so I just don't understand it, because it does seem to me that lots and lots of public money has gone into this research. And why that means that they can charge anything they want, I don't understand. On the other hand, I also don't understand why we say that because public money went into something, it necessarily has to be free. There are lots of things that public money has gone into that aren't free, and that you still have to pay something for. And that doesn't seem to me particularly scandalous either. So, I don't have an informed opinion on that one, but I do hope that that the vaccine is widely available and fast.
I vote for fast. So someone else asked a question about how to make collaborative activities more mutually beneficial. And they're asking about international partnerships. But what about at the corporate academic level? Do we need to revisit that relationship? I think from the point of view of kind of these emerging dynamics around openness. Daniel, I'm asking you.
Oh, well, I thought if it has that international character that you might start.
Well, my concern there is coming up with perhaps a statement of norms that perhaps more clearly lays out expectations to which we would agree. And there are a number of people, I think, that are moving in that direction. So, and we'll see what happens with the new administration.
So I think an important word when talking about these international relationships is mutuality. In other words, if other partners want to play by similar rules, they won't be identical, but similar rules, then we ought to be able to exchange all sorts of things. But if we're really quite open about what we're doing and our partners in other countries simply aren't, then that seems to me not to be a very healthy situation. And how you negotiate and enforce some of those norms and rules and everything is a difficult question. But it does seem to me like an emphasis on mutuality is got to be part of the answer.
So
Go ahead,
thank you
Dana.
so much. Oh, Caroline, do you want to?
No, go ahead, Dana. Why don't you?
Oh, no, yeah. So thank you so much, Caroline, for also fielding some of the really excellent questions from the audience. The first one about COVID-19 and the second one about the sort of global partnerships. I mean, one thing that is interesting about COVID-19 is that it's exactly the sort of the task, right? So it's like everyone has like, there is a problem to be solved right now. And so there is a sort of, it's sort of the opposite of the phenomena that you were talking about, in which, Caroline, in which, you know, sometimes the best feature of academic research is its sort of open-endedness, right? So do you think that, so just building off of Jason Barkalou's COVID-19 question, do you think that given the sort of crisis right now, there should be different norms or policies in place related to corporate academic partnerships that outside of the pandemic wouldn't be appropriate, but during the pandemic seem like they are sort of should be the modus operandi for the way in which we think about these relationships?
Well, my own personal opinion is there should be compulsory licensing of any intellectual property around a vaccine, but that's my personal opinion. I'm not necessarily going to say that that's a result of you know, years of legal research. So, but it just seems to me to be the humanitarian approach. And then we know under the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreements, right? Nations can indeed use intellectual property if they're only going to make it for internal consumption, internal production, and sharing. So actually there are international laws that would govern that. The question would be, how do the corporations handle the sharing of the information? And that's where I think personally, my sense would be a humanitarian need really should trump any efforts to hold on to intellectual property. But again, personal opinion.
I would just add to that personal opinion that along the lines of compulsory licensing, it just seems to me that all of this business with patent thickets and patent trolls, that's just a dead weight loss on society. And we really need to make that much more transparent, and so that if people have rights, you know what those rights are, and you can trade them, you can you know, deal with them in a rational way. But having all this obscurity and people who are just trying to you know, skim profits off of that obscurity and obfuscation seems to me like a dead weight loss. And as for your question more directly, Dana, about whether the relationships between corporations and universities should change in light of the pandemic, I think that almost all institutions are going to change because of the pandemic, that the world will not necessarily work the same way when we're finished with this, that universities don't change very quickly, but they may have to change rather quickly because of all of this. The whole business models, how we deal with students, how we think about teaching, how we think about research, how we think about really the social contract that universities have had with the public. I think a lot of that is just going to change. And there aren't very many times when all the balls are kind of thrown up in the air like this. But when they do, they could land in many different places. And thinking about how we would like them to land that might be a little bit better, or nudging them in a better direction, is something that we all need to be concerned about, in addition to the vaccine. The vaccine is not going to solve everything. Even when we have the vaccine, we're facing enormous social, behavioral, and economic problems. And so I pray every day for the people who are doing that biomedical work, but we also have to keep an eye on the institutions, the social, the behavioral, and the economic problems that some of which have been around for a long time, but that are now brought to the fore because of the pandemic. So I think everything's up in the air.
I mean, one thing I'll note just from both of your responses is the sort of mandate for IP and licensing are about humanitarian concern and just sort of like the social responsibility of these corporations rather than thinking backwards, looking for who funded the research, which I think is an interesting dynamic, right? Thinking through like what our responsibilities are and what like researchers and corporations' responsibilities are. You don't always have to think about, well, who funded the money? That's one of the considerations, but it's interesting that the sort of rationales that at least your opinions are about this forward-thinking humanitarian concerns. So anyway, that's
well, and I think this is where I have such hope in your generation, because your generation has questioned a lot of these dynamics that have almost had a runaway effect over the last decade or more, right? Where we see the rich get richer. I mean, the rich always get richer, right? That's the nature of dynamics, of social dynamics. But it's the role of public policy to come in and mitigate the natural order, natural organization that you see in social systems. And so, you know, I think the questions your generation is asking is what, you know, about what is a fair profit? What are the total life cycle costs of producing things? You know, how do we justify some ownership of really important humanitarian goods, right? I mean, and I think this is where I have such hopes for you, because I think that your natural, I think, ethical tendencies are to look for fairness. And I'm always impressed with my students and with your generation who are, I think you're going to remake the world. And I think it's a wonderful thing. But I would say going into this post-COVID period, let's not over institutionalize the responses. Let's let some things emerge as kind of naturally as they can.
So maybe I'll just ask the last question, and this is just an opportunity for you to have some closing remarks, is what elements of data sharing that have shifted recently, either due to the pandemic or maybe due to this open science movement, that you hope should be carried on into the future? What are you excited about in terms of these kinds of partnerships and the new arrangements of data sharing that you really hope to see?
All right, I'll just jump in really quick, and that is, you know, the pandemic has supercharged open science, right? We see that everything's being dumped into preprint, archive sharing, other kinds of sharing, and also data platforms have become open, and people are really striving to share data. It's just been a tremendous human effort all around the world. It's been overall, I think we're going to come out, as Daniel said, we're going to see changes, and that is one of the changes. It's supercharged openness. Now we have to deal with the implications of that. Openness isn't a total blessing, right? There are problems. When people dump their preprints out there, you don't know the quality of them, and it's hard to track them. But even so, I think we've come into a new era. So with that, I'll pass.
No, I agree that it's all really very exciting, all this trend towards openness, and there's a lot of public benefit to be gained from that. I think there are a lot of open questions about how this can actually work. One of the ones that as a funder I always think about is, well, who's going to pay for all of this? And there are private foundations and others who can help start things, but sustaining that kind of openness over the long run is really not a simple question. And if you ask what I'm looking forward to, it's not just innovative ways of sharing like this, but innovative ways of putting together the institutional arrangements and the incentives and the financing so that it really can be sustained and so that it can do all the good that we think it should.
Well, thank you so much for a jam-packed session. I'm sure there's even more questions than answers, but I really appreciate you taking the time and talking about these big issues with us.
Thank you for organizing, and thank
Yeah,
you
thanks so much.
Daniel.
Keep up the good work and everybody stay well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.